Great. So welcome everyone. My name is Elizabeth. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the Education Director at Mazzoni Center, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to present to you today. Again, just some housekeeping. I do have the chat box. I will do my very best to monitor it during the presentation. I'll try to get some Q&A time at the end, and I will also make sure that I get answers to your questions so they can be emailed to you directly. So I want to make sure that everything is answered for you. I also have closed captioning on the bottom as an additional accessibility measure. So since we're meeting for the first time, that's me in the corner. I'd like you to get to know a little bit about me. I am, as well as the Education Director at Mazzoni Center, I'm also a licensed therapist in New Jersey, yay, South Jersey. I don't know if anybody else is in the Jersey, place, but I'm from Jersey. I am a parent to a 1-year-old Winter, and they are absolutely nonstop. They may be crying in the background at sometime during this webinar. I hope not, though. And I craft for self-care. That's something that I do for myself. And I also have a shot glass on my windowsill in the kitchen. And it's been there for about 2 years. And my partner just realized that it was there a couple days ago. So I wanted to share this with you because, as legend has it, Marsha P Johnson, the P stands for Pay No Mind, a self-described Black gay drag queen, smashed a shot glass into a bar during the Stonewall riots of 1969. The Stonewall riots, for those of you who are not familiar, was a catalyst for the gay rights movement here in the United States and actually around the world as well. Marsha's moment has been, even though it is, it could potentially be a legend, but Marsha was there. Marsha's moment has become known as the shot glass heard around the world. I think of her and what that shot glass represents as I cook for my child, get ready for the day, fill up my coffee mug, and I just realize that these tasks that I'm doing, these everyday tasks, as a privileged white cis woman, I can complete that with no fear. That shot glass really embodies the years of trauma and abuse that Marsha and her peers have experienced because of racism and oppression. But it also speaks to the ebb and flow of what activism really is. That sometimes we have to get to that point for someone to listen, but we don't have to, because we can do the work now. And so we're really talking about advocating today, and I am encouraging you to start thinking about becoming an activist so people will listen now and we don't have to get to that point of violence. So during this slide, I'd like to just take a moment of silence here. Nationally, we are facing lots of violence against Black trans women of color. We just lost a person, Dominique Remy Fells, in Philadelphia. And I'd like to just take a moment of silence here to memorialize her and all the trans women of color murdered this year and the impact that they had and would have had on this world. And I have their names on the screen here. Thank you so much. These moments of silence are vital to really mindfully recognizing the suffering of others and remembering their spirit, and also reflecting on what we can do better. I'm just gonna take a sip of my coffee. Okay, so let's review our objectives for today. After this workshop, you will be able to describe the differences between gender expression, assigned sex, gender identity, and sexual orientation. You're going to be able to explain the reason for using gender neutral language and apply it regularly and comfortably. You're consistently going to be able to apply pronoun best practices in interactions with others. And you're also recognizing areas of growth for best serving LGBTQ plus people. And I want you to be able to identify 2 action steps for moving forward. So I am here to help guide you through the first 3 objectives, but this last objective of considering where your areas of growth are really lies in your hands. We can't point out which areas are most confusing to you or which areas you might need to do some extra work and learning about on your own. But with every learning experience, we all have areas of growth. I'll be assisting you by asking questions throughout the webinar and encouraging you to complete some reflective activities throughout the webinar, so grab a pen and paper. But ultimately, really, it's your responsibility to cover your areas of growth. So a few notes before we begin. I want to talk to you about the learning process. So using Bloom's taxonomy, the foundation of the learning process begins with remembering and understanding the information. So that's our trajectory for today. We need to have a solid grasp on remembering and understanding and learning the information we're about to cover before we can effectively begin applying, analyzing, evaluating, or creating anything new. Now, I know as adult learners, you want to get to that analyze, evaluate, create. You want to get to that, really how you apply this information on a daily basis. And we will get to that, but I want you to just have patience with yourselves, especially those that haven't gotten this information before. I want to note we have a bit of a time limitation, and I can only cover so much information in our allotted time. So we're not going to be able to touch on a really in-depth on knowledge and practices and policies, but that's something that I would love to come back and speak to you about in the future. All this to say, I really want you to keep in mind that today is just the start of this conversation. At the end of the webinar, you're going to have a list of resources for ongoing self-education. And actually at Mazzoni Center in our department, we offer coaching and consultations for anyone who is interested in figuring out how to navigate this environment. So our roles, as the audience, you do have some important roles during our time together. We encourage you to do 3 specific things. Keep the focus on progress, not perfection. Manage your expectations with your learning process and don't give up. And this is really important. Manage your feelings of discomfort and take risks. The most important thing in learning is being uncomfortable. You have to be uncomfortable, especially as adults, in order to start really thinking about new information and retaining it. For those that are learning this content for the first time, please have patience with yourselves. You're not going to be an expert by the end of this, and you're not expected to be. For those who are familiar with these topics already, we really encourage you to think about this webinar as an opportunity for learning new ways of framing these concepts. And if at any time during this webinar you feel uncomfortable, I really encourage you to sit with that feeling. But if it's becoming too much for you, feel free to just step back, and you can always go back to the recorded webinar if you need that time and space. So as your facilitator, one of my roles is to highlight the nuanced experiences of LGBTQ plus people. So LGBTQ plus stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer or questioning. Some of you may have seen an I or an A at the end, which stands for intersex and asexual or agender, respectively. If we tried to make an acronym that included every single identity within our communities, it would be a whole alphabet and then some, which is why there's often a plus at the end of this acronym. The plus stands for all the people and identities who should be represented but are not clearly reflected in that abbreviated acronym often used. It's important for you to know that LGBTQ plus communities are just as diverse and dynamic as any other group. There are more than 11 million LGBTQ plus folks in the United States, and they hold so many diverse and intersecting identities and experiences. Every LGBTQ plus person has a different experience of their identity based on other factors like their race, their identity, their ethnicity, the language they speak, their social economic status, history of trauma, and so on. This results in a wide variety of experiences of privilege, oppression, discrimination, and inequity. While it be impossible to highlight every single experience that any LGBTQ plus person has ever experienced, we often talk about LGBTQ plus people as though all LGBTQ plus people have the same experiences and needs, which is certainly not true. So as another role, I will be encouraging language and practices that are affirming and inclusive of LGBTQ people. We are not here to tell you what to think, believe, or do, but we will be sharing recommendations of best practices and ways of understanding and utilizing this information in a way that best serves the LGBTQ communities. So now that we have a focus for our time together, let's explore why this training matters. Why is it so important to learn about LGBTQ plus fundamentals?
Elizabeth?
Yes.
I'm so sorry to interrupt. I'm getting a couple chat box messages privately that people see a large rectangle blocking the right side of their screen.
That is the chat box.
Okay. Are you able to move it a little bit so it's not covering? Because it shouldn't be showing that. That's kind of
yeah.
I
don't
if you can move it off to the side or make it a little smaller.
I'm making it the smallest I can. You know what? I will just minimize it, and then I will I'll keep checking it once in a while. If anything comes up, if you could just let me know, that would be great.
Okay, now it's gone. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you all for letting me know. So getting back to this slide, we live and work in a society that utilizes social categorization and attempts to control language. We also have a duty to challenge biases and eliminate oppression and optimally advocate for and support LGBTQ plus communities. So, so social categorization is when we mentally cluster together groups of people with similar social identities. This essentially puts people in boxes and groups of people in boxes and can create a social hierarchy that invites bias, discrimination, and oppression between people. This is actually biologically motivated. We are biologically embedded to fear what we don't know. So oftentimes that causes a distance between people that we don't know, people that we don't understand, and it stops us from wanting to understand because we are fearful of it biologically, innately. So in addition to social categorization, there are a few other primary concepts that often shape the way we view and understand gender and sexuality. The first one we'll cover is the ideal or expectation of what's considered normal. What we deem normal is really shaped by where we grew up, the messages we received, the identities we hold, our beliefs and values, among many other factors. Deeming something normal or abnormal when it comes to gender and sexuality can be seriously dangerous, particularly when it's used as a tool to invalidate, oppress, or harm people. So going back to what I had said about that biological innate need to categorize people based on fear. What is comfortable is what we have deemed as normal. So when we see abnormal, we see it as dangerous. In the United States specifically, LGBTQ identity formation begins with the prenatal expectation that everyone is heterosexual or straight and cisgender. So I'm going to be using some words here that I'm going to explain even more in depth later, but please stay with me. So this expectation that everyone is heterosexual or straight or cisgender is made clear by overt messages, implicit messages, and social and material policing that happens over time, from when a child is having to choose between blue and pink toys, up until toys, up until uniforms at school. This is important to note because in the struggle for LGBTQ plus people to exist, the degree to which one can be and live out one's identities is correlated with their health and well-being. So the information we're covering provides knowledge to help you challenge this US expectation of normalcy, as well as help you challenge biases, eliminate oppression, and optimally advocate for and support LGBTQ plus communities. And this in turn increases LGBTQ plus people's safety, equity, health, and well-being. So since I'm speaking to legal folks, what are some important legal barriers which are impacting LGBTQ people today? So we have trans rights. Courts are now fighting over trans Americans serving in the military. Bathroom bans may end up in front of the Supreme Court, and this opens doors for more discrimination, denial of service, and violence. Also, the census. The current administration has removed all references to LGBT people from the US Census, which means that it will be impossible to accurately determine the size of the LGBT population. So when I completed the census this year, it asks a binary question about female and male. So I'd have to choose between female and male when not everyone identifies as female or male. So they don't even have the opportunity to be counted. And we see that a lot in data, that data just doesn't ask the right questions to get the accurate information. So there's also violence against LGBTQ people. Deadly violence against trans people has significantly increased. The ban on HIV positive service members. The current administration recently enacted a ban on HIV positive service members serving in the armed forces. We have workplace discrimination. More than 70 countries provide workplace protections for LGBTQ workers, but in the United States, there's still no federal law prohibiting employment discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. There is no state level protection for sexual orientation in 28 out of the 50 US states, and no gender identity protection in 30 states. There's housing discrimination. There's no federal protection for housing discrimination. Also, there's a big impact right now on LGBTQ adoption. The House, in July 2018, the House Appropriations Committee passed an amendment that would allow adoption agencies to refuse gay couples based on their moral or religious beliefs. And then finally, healthcare access. The removal of the individual mandate requirement of the Affordable Care Act will likely drive up premium prices, and that directly impacts poor people, and they will lose access to healthcare, including many people with HIV/AIDS. Religious freedom laws, and some states are actually already enacting religious freedom laws that allow churches and businesses to refuse service to gay people. And can you imagine in this time of COVID, when somebody goes for a COVID test and they're refused service.
Elizabeth, I'm sorry, while you have this pause between slides, this is Kelly. I am launching the first of the poll box questions. If you are an attorney requesting CLE credit for your participation in this webinar, please respond to this. The poll will be up for 1 minute. Thanks, Elizabeth. You're free to continue.
Sure. And I want to apologize to everyone. I'm going between two screens because working from home has been a little bit of a challenge. So that's why I'm pausing. My notes are on one screen and I'm trying to switch back and forth. So I appreciate your patience in my pauses. So, and the poll is still up. Do you need me to do anything for the polling?
You can just click off of it, Elizabeth.
Okay, perfect.
Thanks.
So you probably all know that a Supreme Court ruling just came that it was a huge ruling for the LGBTQ community. So what does today's Supreme Court ruling really mean for us? So the Supreme Court has ruled that LGBTQ people cannot be fired because of their sexual orientation or because they are transgender as a matter of federal law, affirming legal protections from job discrimination for millions and millions of people. So here's, so while the federal law now offers many protections nationwide, it does have a caveat. It does not protect LGBTQ plus people in some other areas of life, such as business open to the public or federally funded programs. And the law also has gaps in protections, especially updating the law to address modern forms of discrimination. So right now, the big push for advocating for our communities is passing the Equality Act. The House of Representatives passed this legislation in May 2009, and yet it is yet to be passed. So I encourage you to stay on that. So the next concept that I want to go over with you, and arguably the most important aspect of advocating and understanding our communities, highlights how there is no particular identity or experience that everyone shares. Like everyone else, LGBTQ plus people may have identities that intersect and impact their lives in highly individualized ways. On this slide, you will notice some of the many aspects of social identity. So we have LGBTQ plus. Language can be a part of someone's identity. Class, immigration status, age, race, social support. Education, level of education, ethnicity, mental health. As you can see, this is called intersectionality. The intersection of all of these identities and our resulting lived experience because of our identities is called intersectionality. So I want to call in Professor Kimberly Crenshaw. So in 1989, she developed a word called intersectionality. Crenshaw's research really focused on people who identified as Black and also identified as a woman. She found that the experience of those two marginalized identities, being Black and being a woman, compounded or increased the experience of oppression and the resulting minority stress and health disparities. So keep this in mind as we move forward. Most of us experience some identities that give us privilege and some identities that are marginalized and are oppressed. That complicates our lives. It complicates our lived experience, how we show up to work, how we show up in our family and our friends. And it can also help to contextualize and shed light on our differences. All of our identities and experiences impact how we view the world and how the world views us. So right now, I just want to give you a couple minutes to take a moment to reflect on those identities. Which parts of your identities are most and least important to you? How have they impacted your life, your relationships, your feelings of safety and belonging? I'm just going to give you a few minutes to think about that. Is there anyone that might want to share what their thoughts are or why this is important to you in your work or in your family? I can't see the chat box. Kelly, is anybody saying that they'd like to share?
No, no one's responded.
Okay. I know that sometimes being on virtual learning, it'd be a little intimidating. But what's so important is when you are working with clients, just understanding level of how a level of education, someone's race, someone's language, if they speak the language of the community, or if they don't speak that language, how all of those intersecting identities can cause further discrimination and oppression, and just being very aware of that. And also being aware of your power and privilege. As I shared before, I'm a white cisgender woman. So those identities hold a lot of power and a lot of privilege. So what I do is I use that power and privilege to raise up and amplify voices that are less marginalized and that aren't listened to because of their identities. So now that you've had time to reflect on your intersectional identities, it might be easier to imagine how important those identities are to others as well, like I was mentioning before. When asked about those pieces of your identity and lived experience that make you feel safe or unsafe, maybe you thought about your finances, your citizenship, your gender or sexuality, your political affiliation. Many of these pieces of ourselves are invisible, meaning you can't just tell by looking at someone whether they're have experienced trauma, whether they have a disability, whether they have children, what kind of education they have, or if they've lost someone they love. So in the example I used before, a lot of these things you might be able to see or understand pretty quickly, but disability and specifically trauma are experiences that have significant impact on someone's ability to move through the world. We all carry these pieces of ourselves around us wherever we go. The people you encounter also carry their own experiences too. So our final concept, before I get into the quadrants of identity, sorry, excuse me. The final concept that I'm going to be going over is binary systems. So binary, it means elements of two. So I want you to start thinking about this country, and this conversation is very focused on American culture. So binary systems are a way of categorizing people or things into concepts of two. This perspective of this or that and one or the other is very limiting because it prioritizes two elements within a broader category while ignoring the other elements that exist within a group. We do this in so many areas of our lives. For example, it's not uncommon to ask people if they are a cat person or a dog person. There are thousands of other animals that somebody may like. Why do we prioritize those? When we use binary systems with social identities, it's not only limiting, but often extremely harmful. For example, only mentioning Democrat and Republican when discussing political affiliations, rich or poor when discussing social economic status, or only highlighting Black and white people when discussing race. So some of you may have noted, as I was talking about this, another binary system for gender and sexuality. I'm going to go over these quadrants with you now. So let's start by exploring it. And note, like I said before, that we're starting here not because this information is accurate, but it's an attempt to meet folks where they are typically at. In the US, there is no standard education around gender or sexuality, and this is generally how people understand these concepts in relation to one another. So when I'm sharing this with you, I'm not saying that I believe it to be true. I'm just kind of showing you what society expects of human beings. Okay. So here we have two columns which reflect the binary systems that I'm speaking about. We have assigned sex, gender identity, gender expression, and sexual romantic attraction. When a baby is born, we're taught directly or indirectly that a baby's sex will either be male or female. We refer to this as assigned sex because it's designated identity that's being assigned to a person or put on the baby. So the baby is not able to consent to this assignment. And once it's been made, we assume or expect that we know who the baby will grow up to be. For example, let's start with the male column. Babies who are assigned male are generally expected to grow up and be a man, a boy or a man depending on age. And in terms of gender expression, this baby is expected to express themselves as masculine and assumed to be straight or heterosexual. And then on the other side of the column, we have our column for female babies. Female babies are expected to grow up and be girls or women, express themselves in a feminine way, and be straight or heterosexual. There are two important takeaways from this slide. The first one is that these quadrants are relevant to all of us, whether you identify as part of the LGBTQ plus communities or not. We each have an assigned sex. We each have a gender identity, a gender expression, and a sexual orientation. Think about now, how do you fit into these boxes? The second takeaway is that none of these identities determine or inform one another in a linear fashion, even though we've kind of put that in a linear fashion. Human experiences, as you know, are not this simple or predictable. We cannot assume someone's identities based on how they're assigned at birth. Okay, so some of you may be feeling confused by this information. Maybe it differs from what you thought was true. Maybe some of you find it difficult to believe. But for those who feel this way, I have a question for you to consider. The color blue is typically associated with boys, right? And pink is typically associated with girls. Has it always been that way? The answer is actually no. It was not too long ago that blue was considered a girl's color. Think about Cinderella. And pink was associated with boys because it was seen to be a masculine color, similar to red. Many of the things that we believe or to be inherent or given, such as blue is for boys, pink is for girls, have been socially constructed and designed to hold meanings and that are passed down from generation to generation. Colors are simply colors. They can be associated with any gender. But as a society, we have given them associations that really don't hold much weight or value. When we hold on too tightly onto these social expectations, we often expect, consciously or not, to abide by them. And the reality is that not everyone abides by them. And when they don't abide by them, they are ostracized or seen as other. So we are going to start talking about gender expression. So gender expression is how someone externally communicates their identity to another. I want you to note that this is the only element of gender and sexuality that is observable. As noted in our gender binary slide, we typically describe gender expression as masculine or feminine, but there are so many other gender expressions that exist. such as androgynous, masculine and feminine of center, and so on. What are some of the ways that people can express themselves? People may express themselves through things like clothing, shoes, hairstyles, jewelry, accessories, so on. If you in the audience are, let's say you're assigned sex as female and you identify as a woman, does that mean that you automatically express in a feminine way? No, you can, and what is feminine? We could have a coffee conversation over that too. But just because gender expression is the only element that's visible, it does not mean that we can use what we observe to make assumptions about people's identities. This is super important. Observing how someone acts or dresses on one particular day does not tell us anything about how that person might express themselves the next day or all the time. And it doesn't tell us about the person's pronouns, assigned sex, gender identity, or sexual orientation. So as I mentioned earlier, we all have a gender expression, and this impacts all of us. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. In a kindergarten classroom, there are a group of girls playing princess. A classmate sees what they're playing and comes over to join them. The classmate is a boy and is told he can't join in because boys don't play princess. A fourth grade girl wants to play football, but it's an all-boys team, and she's encouraged to join the dance team instead. A seventh grade boy has a high-pitched voice and has what others describe as a dainty walk. He is bullied on a regular basis for being girly and gay. A senior girl wants to attend her graduation wearing a suit. The school staff forbid her from entering the event because she's not dressed appropriately. At a holiday party, a man goes to the bar and returns to his coworkers with a Cosmo in his hand. He is made fun of by his team for choosing a sissy drink. Not every individual who experiences discrimination or harassment in these scenarios is necessarily LGBTQ+. Gender expectations impact all of us. What's also noteworthy is that when people deviate from gender norms, like I was saying before, it's more socially acceptable for girls and women to express themselves in a masculine way than it is for boys and men to express themselves in a feminine way. For example, a girl who acts or dresses in a more masculine way usually gets called a tomboy and is cool and is awesome and wants to be part of the boys, while a boy who acts or dresses in a more feminine way may get called sissy, weak. I even had this concern when my child was born. I'm raising them as gender neutral, and she was assigned female at birth. And going out to stores, I found that the idea of gender neutral only is brown. That's the only color that is offered for gender neutral. So I want to add that this is because we live in a patriarchal society, which is another coffee conversation, where it's more socially acceptable to be masculine than it is to be feminine, regardless of gender identity. So I hope I am not completely blowing your minds right now. I know this is a lot of information, so please bear with me. So we're going to explore assigned sex next. Assigned sex is an assignment of typically male or female based on characteristics associated with reproduction and biology. This assignment is usually made by doctors or other healthcare providers. It's typically based on only one of 4 aspects that make up sex. The 4 are external genitalia, internal reproductive organs, hormones, and chromosomes. When I was going through my pregnancy, I could find out the quote unquote gender of my child during the pregnancy, but it only took into account hormones during one test, chromosomes during another test, internal reproductive and external during my scan, but not all together. So I said that the assignments are typically male or female. On birth certificates and other legal documents, these would be denoted by an M marker for male and an F for female. But who is this binary assignment leaving out? intersex people, among many other sexes. Fortunately, this is slowly shifting, and there are many states and cities and countries and counties across the country that now are offering X marker. What does intersex mean? So intersex generally means that there is a difference or variation in a person's sex development or characteristics. Just like any other part of our biology can vary, for example, the size, shape, or traits of our noses and ears, there's a wide range of ways that our bodies vary along the domains of sex as well. Being intersex is about as common as being a redhead, which is about, I think, 2% of the population. And there is no one way of looking or being intersex. Variations in intersex persons' sex development may be related to their external genitalia, chromosomes, and internal reproductive organs. So you might be asking, why do you need to know this as lawyers? So you don't necessarily need to know about someone's body. You're not going to automatically ask them, about their body parts. But there might be times when people come to you and they're being discriminated against because they're being oppressed by their identity, or they're being harassed because of their shape of their body. Or if they have to take a shower with other people, they might be being harassed. So it's really important for you to understand that there are more examples of sex than just female and male. So we're going to move on to gender identity. So gender identity is an individual's deep-rooted understanding of their identity on a gendered spectrum. Just give me 1 second, folks. My computer is not working. So gender identity, like I was saying, is an individual's deep-rooted internal understanding of their identity on a gendered spectrum. Gender identity is not biological. So it doesn't necessarily have to do with our body parts, hormones, or chromosomes. It's a core understanding of who we are, regardless of the sex that we were assigned at birth. Since our society operates within this binary system, gender is often portrayed as this. The blue outline, oops, excuse me. Oh, my outline is not working. So blue outlines of people are supposed to represent men, and pink outlines of people wearing a dress are supposed to represent women. However, gender is more like this, where I've highlighted it, highlighted the box in red. These depictions don't necessarily represent specific genders, but they highlight how there are far more than two genders. Contrary to popular belief, the terms sex and gender are not interchangeable. So let's break down gender identity a little bit further. This slide is for learning purposes only. It's not intended for you to make assumptions about people or to map their identities without their permission. So hypothetically speaking, say we have someone who is assigned male at birth and is a woman. What might be that person's gender identity? This person's gender identity might be a trans woman, transgender woman, or another identity. So on the other side, if you see a person's gender identity might be a man, they would be a transgender man, a trans man, or another identity. These are trick questions because we really cannot know someone's gender identity until it has been shared with us. So what word does transgender mean? So that word trans, so that word trans and transgender really means across from. When we put before the word gender, it means that a person's assigned sex is across from their gender identity. There are many different transgender identities, which is highlighted with all of the lines, the crisscross lines here. If we look at the purple dot lying outside of the gender identity spectrum, this hypothetical person may be agender, or someone who does not identify with having a gender. This person may be assigned male at birth. We do not know. So the next aspect that I want to discuss really briefly is transitioning. When discussing transgender identities, really it's crucial to talk about this. In regards to gender, what does transitioning mean? When we ask this question during trainings, we typically get guesses like changing or moving one to the other. It makes sense why people think that, given the lack of education and media representation around transitioning and trans people. But transitioning in this context means to affirm one's gender. There are 3 ways that a person can transition. Their social transition would be expression, their name, their pronouns. There's legal transition, which is where your services would come in. And this is something that we do at Mazzoni Center. Name change on IDs, gender marker change on IDs, and then medical. So there's hormones, multiple medical procedures to affirm gender identity. There is no one way to transition, and not every trans person wants to transition, and not everyone who needs to transition is able to. Why? Because depending on where a person lives, what is legal and available, their age, their ability to pay, or have a process covered by insurance, it varies greatly from state to state. So it's important wherever you're practicing to know the law where you are for how to protect and affirm your clients while they're transitioning, if that is their choice. So language matters. This is not an issue of being sensitive or having to walk on eggshells. It really matters because we are human beings that communicate using language. The words we use are fundamental to creating effective, supportive, and trustworthy environments. It's vital for all people that you are serving, including those who are LGBTQ+, to be in environments and offices where people consistently use respectful, affirming, and appropriate language. How we talk to and about LGBTQ+ people conveys how we understand, think, and feel about them. And how we talk to and about LGBTQ+ people has the power to also build or destroy trust with them. If you value helping over harming, pay attention to the language that you use. So, oh, yes?
Sorry, this is Kelly again. I'm going to launch the second and final of the CLE question polls. If you're an attorney requesting credit for your participation in this webinar, please respond and you'll have 1 minute to do so. And back to you, Elizabeth. Thanks.
Thank you. Oh, I'm going to take off this. So language matters. We use gendered language all the time, but it really isn't necessary. So it's not working again. Some gender neutral options that you can try in your practice is using everyone, folks, people, you all. So you're not categorizing people just based on, and it's usually gender expression that we're basing it on. So getting used to the habit of saying these gender neutral gender neutral words is very important. And one of the handouts that I created for you is going to go even more in depth to suggestions for that. So pronouns. Pronouns is something that a lot of people get hesitant about talking about. What are pronouns? So simply put, pronouns are terms that refer to someone or something without using their formal name. Some common pronouns are they, them, she, her, and he, him. There are many others as well. The first thing that I want to talk to you about is that language adapts. As humans, we are constantly evolving in many ways, including the degree to which we understand our identities and the language we use to better communicate who we are, our thoughts, and our needs to one another. The second consideration for those who might be feeling like this is really complicated is that you're probably already using they, them pronouns and don't even really use it. For instance, imagine you're in the classroom with a group of people. The class ends and everyone gets up to leave, and you say behind to ask a teacher a question. As you approach the teacher says, oh, someone forgot their backpack. You probably wouldn't look around wondering how many people forgot their backpacks. That's not what you're insinuating. You're just insinuating that someone forgot their backpack. So are singular they, them pronouns correct? The dictionary, all dictionaries actually, say yes. Like I was just saying, language adapts, and we already use singular they, them pronouns. So some questions that I want to go through with you today, and I know we're getting close on time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send out the answers to these questions, as well as we have a map on how to handle if you do make a mistake when using someone's pronouns incorrectly. So our last and final quadrant is sexual orientation. This is a person's physical, romantic, emotional, sexual, and or form of attraction to another. Really the biggest takeaway here from this section is that someone's identity, so who they are, the labels they use to describe who they are, doesn't really tell us anything about their sexual or romantic behaviors. This is really important for medical professionals because if someone comes in and says that they're straight, that doesn't mean that they're not having anal sex with a man. It really is important to understand that identity does not equal behavior, and your identity can also be expressed in behavior in different ways. Like if you feel very emotionally connected to someone of a certain gender, that may just look like holding hands or hugging or just needing comfort for them. So it can look in multiple ways. It can look in a variety of ways. So again, just going over identity. So asexual, straight, bisexual, and behavior is kissing, dating, flirting, marriage, cuddling. So someone can marry a cis man, but cannot marry a cis man, but they might identify as bisexual. Oh, and I want to go back. I realized I didn't explain cisgender. So cisgender, if we talk about the word transgender, cisgender is the opposite of transgender. So it's someone that identifies with the sex that they were assigned at birth. So it's a very important word because it takes away the othering of the use of the word transgender. So if there's a cisgender and a transgender person, it's not a person and then another transgender person. So that's the importance of the word cisgender. So for inclusive language, our key recommendations for you are avoid making assumptions, use inclusive language, mirror the language that people use. That's really important. People will tell you how they want to be spoken to, by just saying, oh, over the weekend, I went out and I went out with my partner to the theater. You then know, okay, they prefer to use the word partner. So really paying attention, being self-reflective, and taking a moment to really understand the person that you're speaking to. So we don't have time for to play this game, but I'm just going to say under the demographic section of an intake form, a person writes intersex and pansexual as two of their identities. They are referring to assigned sex, which is intersex, and sexual orientation, which is pansexual. You have a new client coming in, and the client is a teenager wearing high heels and has long hair. During this appointment, the youth shares that they are a lesbian. What do you know? Okay, so you can observe that they're wearing high heels and has long hair. You can observe gender expression. You always can observe gender expression. And they've shared that they're a lesbian, so you know their sexual orientation. You don't know anything about their gender identity or assigned sex. You meet a new coworker. Her name is Monique, and her pronouns are she, her. You ask Monique how she's doing, and she responds that she's tired because she just got back from honeymooning with their husband. You know nothing about any of these components based on that. So again, the takeaways. One part of a person's identity does not determine or inform another. Wrong language in the brain, the language that we've received from communication from our families through the media, is if that is embedded in our brain, that will be the language that we use. So we have to actively we need to actively change it and practice it. And this unlearning and relearning takes a shift in mind frame, and these concepts are not limited to binaries. So I'm going to just leave you in honor of Juneteenth and the current national crisis for Black and African Americans. I'd like to share this additional thought. I recognize, and we at Mazzoni Center recognize, that Black people in America, some of whom are LGBTQ, are systematically oppressed, and we stand together affirming that Black lives matter and Black trans lives matter. And as LGBTQ organizations and people that are advocating for LGBTQ people, we need to acknowledge that while our work is bound up in movements for racial healing and justice, and many members of our organizations and communities have shown up to support this movement, we historically haven't done enough. We need to do more. And it was best said by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., in the end, you will remember not the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends. So thank you so much. And if I will take any questions that you may have, and I would encourage you to just think about what are your areas of growth here? What are 2 ways you plan to address this? I know I gave you a ton of information today in a very short hour, but I appreciate your attention very, very much. And I will be sending out my slides to you, which include all the resources, national, local, the references that I used, as well as some additional professional development that you can use. And if you want to take down my email address, it's ekahn@mazzonicenter.org. Ekahn, and that's EKAHN @mazzonicenter.org.
Wonderful, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for all of this information. I think a lot of us have learned a lot of new things today. I don't see any questions coming in, so unless you have anything else, I think we'll go ahead and end for today, and thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much for having me. Reach out if you have any questions, and if you have any feedback as well. I would love to work with you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Take care, everyone.
Bye, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.